Racing Point was recently fined $400,000 and punished 15 points for breaking sports regulations by putting Mercedes-designed rear brake ducts on this year's car. And that got me thinking about prior Formula One sanctions and how punitive they were. We'll strap you in as we look over 5 of the most horrific penalties in Formula One history. Spygate 2007. Nigel Stepney, Ferrari's chief technician, was dissatisfied with the team's performance at the start of 2007, particularly after he was relocated to a factory job later that year. He was accused of emailing McLaren's principal designer, Mike Coughlin, 780 pages of private Ferrari material. After that, his wife photocopied them at a local shop in Woking. The only issue is that the photocopier shop employee was a Ferrari fan who discovered the documents were confidential Ferrari property and contacted the factory to inform them. The teams performed investigations, and Coughlin and Stepney were terminated by their teams, which appeared to be the end of the matter. Despite claims that McLaren obtained and utilized this data, the investigation indicated that Coughlin acted alone and that no one else on the team was aware of what was going on. However, the Hungarian Grand Prix took place a few weeks later. Lewis Hamilton violated a team instruction during qualifying in an attempt to sabotage colleague Fernando Alonso. Infuriated, Alonso famously waited longer in his pit box than he should have, allowing him enough time to get out and set a pole position lap, but preventing Hamilton from doing so. As a result, Alonso was penalized and given a grid penalty, while McLaren was barred from collecting any constructors' points from the race for bringing the sport into disrepute. This, however, was only the top of the iceberg. On the morning of the race, a furious Alonso contacted Ron Dennis, threatening to reveal emails he and McLaren test driver Pedro Della Rosa exchanged, confirming that McLaren was aware of the sensitive Ferrari knowledge. Dennis quickly claimed that Alonso had blackmailed him in front of FIA President Max Mosley and that the allegations were without merit. The FIA was forced to reopen the investigation as a result of the new claim. For testifying and revealing the truth about what was going on, the 3 drivers, Hamilton, Alonso, and Della Rosa, were essentially given immunity. The FIA announced its new verdict on September 13th, well over a month after the Hungarian Grand Prix and almost 2 months after it was initially cleared. McLaren was found guilty due to the drivers' honesty, as well as the fact that they were both involved in a thrilling championship duel with Kimi Räikkönen, which everyone was fascinated by. They were allowed to compete for the championship, but McLaren was banned from the Constructors' Championship and fined a whopping $100 million. Despite being one of the most severe penalties in sports history, it could have been much worse. Most people joked that the fine would be $5 million for the violation and $95 million for Ron Dennis's incompetence. He had intended to ban McLaren for 2 years, but was persuaded to be more lenient by Bernie Ecclestone. McLaren was also threatened with a points loss for the next season if the 2008 car included any Ferrari data, but once the team offered a complete official apology, Mosley judged that the team had suffered enough and left them alone. Ferrari Team Orders 2002. Rubens Barrichello had dominated the Austrian Grand Prix from pole and looked destined to win for the first time in nearly 2 years, but as he approached the final curve on the final lap, he halted and handed Michael Schumacher the prize on a silver platter. Team orders had always existed in Formula One, but they had never been so obvious. It was also disheartening because it was only the 6th race of the season, and it was difficult to justify Ferrari needing to raise Schumacher's points count so early in the season, especially given Barrichello was still a title contender. It was disappointing to say the least, and it reinforced many fans' suspicions that Schumacher was not only the clear front-runner, but that whoever was number 2 at Ferrari wouldn't be permitted to beat him. The crowd booed at the end of the race when Schumacher and Barrichello went to the podium awkwardly to accept their trophies. Nobody really benefited from what had happened, but it was perfectly legal and nothing could be done. The podium ceremony, on the other hand, gave the FIA with the opportunity they needed. Schumacher pushed Barrichello to the top of the podium before handing him the race winner's trophy, clearly recognizing how terribly the whole miserable spectacle had gone down. They had broken podium protocol in doing so, and the FIA decided to make an example of them. A $1 million punishment was imposed on the team and the 2 drivers, with half of it being paid immediately and the other half being postponed for a year. It also resulted in the FIA banning team orders, which had an impact on the race's outcome for the 2003 season. That restriction was in place until 2010, but it was ineffectual since teams had simply moved to coded messages. When Ferrari gave another blatant team order for Felipe Massa to give up the win for Fernando Alonso in that year's German Grand Prix, the FIA decided the team orders ban was too tough to enforce, and the rule was removed. Bar's extra fuel tank. In 2004, the Bar team finally produced the kind of success it had been promising since entering the sport in 1999. Following a few years of underwhelming results. Jenson Button finished third in the championship after a series of podium finishes. Teammate Kumasato was a little less successful as he began to seem like one of the sport's top drivers due to some poor reliability, but he was still speedy, and the team placed second to Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship in 2005. Despite the fact that the team had failed to score after 3 races, things were looking well at Emilia. Button qualified third and placed fifth, while Sato began sixth and placed fifth. The festivities, however, did not last long. Button's car was discovered to be underweight after the race. Normally, this would result in a simple disqualification, but there was more to it than that. The stewards discovered that Bar had fitted a hidden secondary fuel tank that could contain almost 11 kilograms of extra fuel, allowing the car to theoretically run under the minimum weight restriction, which was 605 kilograms in qualifying and 600 kilograms in race conditions at the time. This also meant that when scrutineers and stewards asked if all of the fuel had been drained from the cars, the team had lied and said it had when it hadn't. Bar insisted that the extra fuel was required for the vehicle to function. It said that if the engine didn't have enough gasoline, it wouldn't pump it effectively, and that it never went under the weight restriction, though this was difficult to confirm. Despite the fact that the meeting's scrutineers accepted Bar's explanation, the FIA was not convinced after hearing at the International Court of Appeal. Despite his car being over the minimum weight restriction in Imola, Button was disqualified from the San Marino Grand Prix. On top of that, the team was disqualified from the next 2 races in Spain and Monaco, as well as receiving a 6-month ban postponed for a year. It might have been a lot worse because FIA President Max Mosley was concerned about not cheating and wanted the Bar team to be suspended for the rest of the season, which would have been a bit harsh. Schumacher's intentional collision 1997. It was the final race of 1997 at the Jerez track in Spain, and Michael Schumacher was competing for the title against Jacques Villeneuve in a Ferrari. In theory, whomever won the race would win the championship, but if they both failed to finish, Schumacher would. Schumacher took the lead at the start, but Villeneuve was gaining up to him as the race went. With 23 laps remaining, Villeneuve attempted a move into Jerez's dry sack corner, which is in fact a corner. It was a large lunge, but it was manageable, especially because Schumacher could see him coming. He yanked himself out of the path. However, a fraction of a second later, he changed his mind and turned into the Williams. Schumacher's front wheel collided with Villeneuve's side pod, and he ended up in the gravel. Villeneuve continued on his merry way, despite the fact that everyone could see what had transpired. Martin Brundle, speaking on commentary, stated that didn't work. "Michael, my friend, you've hit the incorrect portion of him." With Schumacher out of the race, Villeneuve simply needed to get his damaged car to 6th place to win the championship. He finished third and won the championship, despite the fact that the stewards had ruled it a racing incident at the time, and accidents had decided the title in 3 of the previous 8 seasons, and the FIA wanted to end it. Schumacher was summoned by the FIA to a disciplinary hearing in Paris 2 weeks after the race. All of his racing results would stand, but he would be disqualified from the Drivers' Championship and forced to participate in the following year's FIA road safety program. One worried German citizen sought legal advice to see if Schumacher could be prosecuted with attempted murder, but happily, common sense won out, and the charge, if you can call it that, was withdrawn. Was it successful? Since then, no world championship has been determined by a fight between the contenders for the title, so it appears that the message was received. Andrea Moda, 1992. Andrea Moda appears to be a typical early 1990s backmarker team on paper. Andrea Moda stood out because of the extremely shambolic method in which the team was handled. They had a substandard car that mostly failed to qualify for races and didn't even last the entire season. The team was not able to compete in the first race of the season in South Africa because it had not paid the entrance fee, and the cars in Mexico had not yet been built in time. Both Alex Caffey and Enrico Bertaggia, the drivers, had realized how much of a jerk Andrea Moda was. Caffey was fired for saying so, while Bertaggia chose to leave. In their place, Roberto Moreno and Perry McCarthy were brought in. Moreno gave it his all and, amazingly, qualified for the Monaco Grand Prix, but McCarthy might as well not have been there at all. He couldn't get out of the pit lane because of an engine failure. In Spain, he was sent out to qualify on wet tires in the dry at Silverstone, and in Hungary, he was sent out of the pit lane so late that by the time he made it to the start line, time had expired and he couldn't set a lap. The FIA recognized that McCarthy was being treated unfairly and warned Andrea Moda that if they did not make a genuine effort to run a second car for McCarthy, they would be kicked out of the sport. Other disasters the team had this season included failing to show up for the Canadian Grand Prix without any engines and having to borrow one from Brabham, as well as missing the French Grand Prix entirely due to the team's trucks becoming stranded in a blockade. At the Spa, it all reached its peak. McCarthy was dispatched with a steering part that had been taken from Moreno's car and was known to be broken by the team. Going through Eau Rouge, his steering froze, and he was lucky to avoid a massive accident. On the same weekend, Andrea Sassetti, the team's boss, was arrested on the paddock on forgery charges. The FIA had seen enough and suspended the team from Formula One a week later for failing to run a team to F1 standards and bringing the sport into disgrace. Andrea Moda showed up to Monza despite being banned to try and race, but was denied admission to the paddock. Were you surprised by these penalties? Let us know in the comments section below, and as always, make sure to like, subscribe, and smash that notification bell.